This week on Vaticano, join us and discover two of the most breathtaking basilicas in the world, those of Saints Peter and Paul, both built over the tombs of the very patron saints of Rome. Learn about the monumental square in front of the Petrine Church, the Obelisk, Michelangelo's dome, and Bernini's one-of-a-kind Canopy. And about its twin church, St. Paul's outside the walls, with its welcoming space and the portraits of the popes, from St. Peter on to Pope Francis. For this in-depth encounter with history and art, Vaticano starts now. Welcome to St. Peter's Basilica. Some hold it as the most beautiful edifice in the world. Since its construction, it's been the heart of Catholicism in the world and focal point of papal liturgical activities. The Basilica, dedicated to the Prince of the Apostles, is one of the largest churches in the world. It has the largest interior space of any church ever built. But the first thing visitors see is the welcoming square that embraces the masses.
I think the word welcome is the key word for understanding the whole Piazza San Pietro, as we call it. The idea of approaching this building with so much history behind it. I mean, this site goes back 2,000 years in Christian history, and yet not being welcomed by the overwhelming presence of almost a defensive building. Neither that or just the overwhelming wall of history, but with open arms. And I think the great gift of St. Peter's Piazza is this colonnade that seems to reach out and almost welcome the pilgrims into the fold and gather them into this space, first and foremost as a community centered around that obelisk which you see in the center. And as we center around that obelisk drives us back 2,000 years in history. When it wasn't there in front of the church, it was originally put off to the side. It wasn't a feature of a Christian city, it was a feature of a Roman emperor. And it was part of the horse racing circus built by the Emperor Caligula, which had been built pretty much adjacent to where the Basilica is today. And in that spot, in the shadow of that obelisk, which today we refer to as the silent witness, St. Peter was crucified upside down. So we're gathered together around that silent witness, remembering that moment when Peter was killed and this repercussions of a great fire sent by a crazed Emperor Nero. But then we see immediately behind it all that grew from St. Peter, that basilica, that dome, and that glorious orb at the top.
The location of the basilica is somewhat unique since it's outside the ancient walls, but that had a particular reason.
The original churches, these 5 churches that are built on martyr tombs, are built necessarily outside of the city because Roman law required that people be buried outside the city. What happened with the tomb of St. Peter is that Peter was simply buried in a hole in the ground. He was executed in a horse racing circus, and being a pauper in a state of very, very violent persecution, the best his friends could do would be to take the body out of the horse racing circus, bring it to the first quiet space, dig a hole in the ground, put the body in it, cover it with some dirt, and cover it with some pieces of brick. And the amazing part of this story and everything you see flowering behind it is that this is the moment that the Romans finally made a mistake. It was the moment when it seemed that they had crushed out the Christians, they had rid themselves of this Christian presence, but actually inadvertently throwing that body in the hole in the ground, thinking they had taken out the trash, the Romans planted a seed. And we look at the flowering of that seed every time we look at the basilica, because the basilica is sitting directly on top of that tomb. If you start from the orb at the very top of that dome and drop a line down, it will drop through 2,000 years of history, through monuments and altars and makeshift walls, all the way down to the hole in the ground where the Romans first made the mistake of discarding that stone, which is Peter.
In the mid-16th century, the Renaissance Pope Julius II, known for his elaborate tastes in art, began a new construction project which would span over 100 years. 4 styles of art and 7 architects later, to the basilica that is seen and visited today by millions of people every year. The first stone was laid on April the 18th, 1506. A major piece of art within the basilica is the canopy, or baldacchino, above the main altar and under the dome.
Understanding the purpose and the size of the baldacchino, or the bronze canopy built by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, it's part and parcel of understanding the importance of St. Peter's tomb. Pilgrims have been coming to this site from when it was just a lonely little tomb on a hill. They came to the site when it was a beautiful church built by Constantine, and they still come to this church today. And every single purpose, the destination of these pilgrims was Peter's tomb. When the new basilica, the one we see today, was begun in 1506, the idea was to build a Greek cross church. That means all the sides are equal. So it would be a natural focus that the center of the church would be where Peter's tomb was. And the magnificent dome completed by Michelangelo was again a feature to focus everyone's attention on Peter's tomb. And then they extended the church. And the church, instead of being a Greek cross, so you would walk in and there's the tomb, all of a sudden it grew to be 187 meters long, and the pilgrims walk in and walk around and go, where's Peter? It obscured the dome from the facade, so you couldn't even see Michelangelo's dome to orient you. So in comes 25-year-old Bernini. First job ever in St. Peter's. Could you do a little something to make Peter's grave more noticeable? And Bernini made a 95-foot tall, 175,000-pound canopy in bronze. Couldn't make it stand up. Ran out of bronze. It was a 4-year project. He was supposed to have it done in 4 years. It ate up 10 years of his life. And the poor man unveils the equivalent of building a 3-story building in bronze inside another building. And what does everyone say? Why'd you use those twisting columns? Because the twisting columns obviously don't fit in with the other Greco-Roman, Corinthian, Doric, Ionic type of architecture that the rest of the church is laid out in. But they never did. Those bronze columns of Bernini, they're simply giant versions of the ancient white marble columns, which are now today in the balconies of St. Peter's, columns given by Constantine.
The Baroque masterpiece of the basilica is the chair of St. Peter, on both sides surrounded by angels and clouds spilling into the basilica.
I think it's interesting to start thinking about the altar of the chair, the altar over the apse in St. Peter's. Interesting to think about it from Bernini's perspective. He was born 40 years after Michelangelo died. He's a sculptor, Michelangelo's a sculptor. They're both from Florence and they both work for the Vatican. So here's Bernini, who's got to compete with the legacy of Michelangelo without ever really being able to meet him from face to face. And if you think of what Michelangelo left between the Jesus of the Pietà and the other images of the first and second person of the Trinity, Bernini decided to set himself a very difficult task. And the task was the third person of the Trinity. How do you represent the Holy Spirit? Do you paint him? Do you sculpt him? Do you build him? What do you do to show the Holy Spirit, which after all is an experience? And Bernini's genius, which manifested itself fully when he was about 50 years old, his 1650s, working on that monument, he represents the Holy Spirit through all the arts. He creates, orchestrates painting, sculpture, and architecture so that we feel present at Pentecost. So starting with the punching of the hole in the back of the church, you have that oval window with the golden glass in it, and the idea of just the wall dissolving so the Holy Spirit can enter. So we get that experience of the closed upper room, the Holy Spirit that enters, because after all, masonry means nothing to the Holy Spirit. And then from that window, the sun sets behind it. So during the Mass, the sun starts to set behind that window, and golden light comes through like the tongues of flame of Pentecost and play off the stucco cherubim and seraphim that frame all the way around the tomb. So it looks like the heavens are open, the cherubs are spilling inwards, and then this enormous cloud comes down and it suspends a giant bronze throne. Now the bronze throne itself is just a reliquary, but it contains Peter's chair when Peter was Bishop of Rome, a simple wooden chair, but a reminder of the cathedra, the seat of Peter, Bishop of Rome, his magisterium.
In a few moments, we'll be back with more on Vaticano. Crowning the church is the majestic dome built by Michelangelo. It was his final gift to the Romans and to the world.
This was the last thing Michelangelo did. Amazingly enough, this is a great personal story in Michelangelo's career. Michelangelo lived to be 89 years old, and he had plenty of time to develop from an arrogant hotshot who's going to change the world with his works of art to a man who became a little bit more thoughtful, a man who knew disappointment. And then at the end of life, a man who really was thinking about redemption, and he was thinking about meeting his creator and what had he created for his creator. And he took the job of completing St. Peter's Basilica for no money. He did it for, and I quote, the glory of God, the honor of St. Peter, the salvation of his own soul. And the other thing he did is he completed the church according to the plan of Bramante, the original architect, who, although he had been a personal enemy, Michelangelo was able to put all that aside and to see that, as he said, this was the only man who knew the truth. And finally, Michelangelo has been passed over for this job. When he was young, when he was vigorous, would have been a great thing on his CV. He had been passed over for this job, and he accepted it anyway. So there's a great deal of personal growth in this work. And Michelangelo worked on this for 19 years. And the final gift he gave to the church is the image that we see above the papal altar. So the altar that you see where the Pope celebrates Mass is directly on top of the tomb of St. Peter. Michelangelo's dome crowns that space. And even though the dome is based on the Pantheon dome, Michelangelo spent 20 years changing the look from that of the Pantheon to what we know today. The Pantheon, perfect building, but it's a perfect pagan building. And everything about the Pantheon is meant to celebrate how men become gods, because the design was by the pagan Romans who believed that. So Michelangelo's decision to recalculate the weight of the dome, to lift it high on top of a drum, and then put all those windows around the base of the dome, one of the most striking things at this time of year to go in there and see are those horizontal beams of light that come through the windows and separate the dome from the altar, as if the dome floats. We remember here that man doesn't fuse heaven to earth when and where he likes. Man doesn't control things. It's the heavens that choose to hover over that spot of Peter's tomb as its perpetual custodian. And that, in many ways, the Pietà, the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment, the David, all those things, in many ways, this was Michelangelo's greatest gift. Because when we see the Pope celebrating Mass there, standing in the footsteps of Peter the Fisherman with this dome of heaven hovering above his head, we know why we call him Pontifex Maximus, as it's written in the front of the church here, the great bridge between heaven and earth.
The Pope is in close connection with this church building. Not only does he celebrate Mass for important events inside and outside of the Basilica, but perhaps the most emblematic moment of a Pope in the Basilica is when the Pontiff comes out for the first time, right after his election, to greet the Urbi et Orbi, the city and the world.
That central balcony where the Pope comes out for the Urbi et Orbi blessing at Christmas and Easter, but that's also where we see our Holy Father for the first time. After that period of feeling bereft of the sede vacante, that expectation of the conclave, and then finally the white smoke, and then a new Holy Father, the family gathered below, looking up to see who will guide the family next. And he stands directly in line with the statues along the top of the church, directly in line with Jesus, flanked by the apostles, except for Peter, because Peter and Paul stand among the crowd. You see them closer to us in the piazza itself, surrounding us, close to us, part of us, our patron saints of Rome really in the city with us. And then all the way around the colonnade, you have the great saints of all time. You have men and women, Africa, Asia, America, Europe. You have martyrs and confessors. You have lay people and religious. There is no one who can't look up into that colonnade and find someone who in some way can share their own real-time experience. And so it's a magnificent sense of community. I mean, you could describe it as a giant Catholic pep rally, but it's really so much more. All these people brought together that Christ at the very top, this great community of saints, and the Holy Father, the 265th successor of St. Peter, there to guide us all. Really a truly amazing experience and a truly amazing design.
Just steps outside the wall that once protected Rome from intruders is a beautiful basilica. It's dedicated to one of the most important men of the early church, the Apostle of the Gentiles, St. Paul. It is outside the walls, since St. Paul suffered martyrdom outside of Rome, and because his remains were buried precisely here. The church building was built by the Roman Emperor Constantine over the burial place of the Apostle, where it was said that after the Apostle's execution, his followers erected a memorial called Achela Memorial.
First and foremost, this is a site that started out as a tomb. It started out as a place of sadness and mourning. When St. Paul was killed, somewhere between 65 and 67, his body was brought back to a piece of property belonging to a woman who had been one of his followers. Her name was Lucina, and she owned a piece of property right here, a stone's throw from the Tiber and on the Via Ostiense, two main passages for the city. And the body was placed into what we're assuming was a very simple hole in the ground, with a few years later perhaps some sort of memorial placed on top of it so that the first few pilgrims would be able to find the tomb of St. Paul. And then from there, with the moment of the legalization of Christianity, it blossomed into something greater and greater and greater, starting with Constantine, who in 324 built a first church on the exact site of the tomb. However, Constantine's church faced in the opposite direction. It was considerably smaller. And so today you see the front of the atrium as we stand here facing towards the Tiber River, but originally it would have been the apse of the church, right where the tomb of Paul was, and the facade of the church faced onto the Via Ostiense. And that church simply wasn't big enough to accommodate the needs of the pilgrims and the desire of all these people to come and see the Doctor of the Gentiles.
The basilica is built in a unique style and has a particular floor plan, that of an ancient basilica.
The word basilica actually comes from the Greeks. It was an allusion to a royal basileus, which was a royal walkway. The Greeks invented it way back when as a kind of structure to create security and crowd control to meet a king. And what that building had was an axiality, sort of a sense of a flow, a well-lit interior, and you could bring people up a central aisle and then bring them out the sides. Now the Romans, after they conquered Greece, saw that building, saw great potential in it, but of course in the Republic they didn't need a building to meet a king, so they brought it to Rome and they basically turned it into a shopping mall. And so they would build little sort of shops and stores off to the side, but always taking advantage of the central light well. But they removed the axiality of the building, so the building didn't have a direction anymore. It was just sort of any which way. However, the building was religiously neutral. So when the Christians were finally in a position with Constantine as of 313 to start building churches, and they are looking around at options for sacred spaces, obviously temples won't do. A, they're small, they're dark, and they've got pagan god cooties. But B, they also don't accommodate people on the inside, and they're dark. So they look at the basilica. The basilica is the perfect building. It's built for size. You can fit as many people as you want in there, giving that idea of the inclusivity. You can flood the building with light, and most importantly, it's a building with an axiality. So the pilgrim comes in and he's directed to where he's supposed to go. It's a microcosm of our pilgrim journey in life and through faith.
Some are doubtful about the tomb of St. Paul, yet the evidence suggests that he was truly buried here.
What they did find was bone matter and some strands of purple and gold sequins. As it just so happens, purple cloth, gold sequins correspond to some of the finds by Peter's bones. And it indicates a precious, something that was very, very precious, wrapped up in a cloth that usually was only accessible by the emperor. So the discovery of this very precious cloth among, or bits of this very precious cloth, among the remnants of human remains is indicative that indeed, that what little there is in the sarcophagus is indeed St. Paul.
We'll be back after a short break with more on Vaticano. The art in the Basilica itself is a sign of ecumenism. When the Pope rebuilt the church after a fire, the whole world contributed to its reconstruction.
Leo XII, Gregory XVI, they asked the entire world to contribute, and the entire world did. So not only was this church built in record time thanks to endless contributions from Christians, Catholics, Protestants all together, but then it was embellished with extraordinary gifts from the most unexpected quarters. So Tsar Nicholas of Russia sent giant pieces of malachite to turn into the spectacular green altars you see flanking the two sides of the church. And of all things, King Fuad I of Egypt sent alabaster, beautiful translucent Egyptian alabaster, to coat the windows and to make these stunning cream-colored columns that greet you as you enter into the church. So this wonderful honor to St. Paul, but also a recognition of the work he did in his lifetime to draw the world together, because it drew together one more time to build this church so quickly that they were able to consecrate it on December 10th of 1854, so 30 years after the fire.
The mutual connection of Peter and Paul is also visible in the fact that both basilicas, St. Peter's and St. Paul's, have identical statues of the saints, only their size differs.
One of the most important points about these two basilicas is this twinship between Peter and Paul. In Rome, as you know, we celebrate June 29th as one of our biggest holidays of the year, and we celebrate it as the day that Peter and Paul were both killed. And as a matter of fact, you see the images within the church of the beheading of St. Paul, the crucifixion of St. Peter, celebrated. They're always placed side by side, celebrated on the same day, because as the two apostles died here, they were born together in heaven, and that makes them twins. And for a city that loves twins, we were founded by Romulus and Remus. These new twin martyrs would be the ones that would refound the Christian city, and that is emphasized not only in the matching statues, but when the emperors rebuilt this church in the 5th century, they turned it. So no longer does it face like St. Peter's, like all the other churches. It doesn't face east. It faces west. It faces St. Peter's. So the two of them look at each other. The two brothers embrace across the city in the very urban planning of the two churches.
One of the most prominent collections of mosaics in the world is contained within the walls. There's a large gallery of the popes, from St. Peter, the first pope, to the current one, Pope Francis. Every single one is represented.
The decoration of this church was very carefully thought out as soon as it was built in 450. It was Pope St. Leo the Great, believe it or not, with all the other things he did. He's also a pope who took a little time to think about church decoration. And he began the idea of representing images of the popes so as to create a genealogy of the papacy, so as to recognize that unbroken line from St. Peter already in his time in 450. And in this church, that tradition has continued, and it was then on top of that made central in the rebuild of this church. So the same church that seemed to be gone and forgotten in 1803 comes back stronger than ever to emphasize the importance of the papacy with these medallions of the popes, which is the delight of pilgrims. I was talking to the mosaic maker. He showed me the tiles he was using for the face of Francis, and the tiles are the oldest tiles of the Basilica of St. Peter, the ones that come from the 16th century that originally decorated the church when it was completed. And he took the oldest tiles of St. Peter's and he used them to make the face of the newest pope. So again, the wonderful sense of old and new that we do so well with here in Rome. There is, of course, a theory that when you run out of space for the medallions, the world will be ending. I wouldn't count on it, but you'll hear that quite often, the question of, well, what happens when they run out of space? I doubt that it will signal the end of the world.
The church is far from being just a tourist attraction like a museum. It's a living church. One of the most important events is the Ecumenical Prayer Vigil, closing the Week of Unity for Christians every year.
A very, very important appointment in this year, and with this church every year, is the time of June 29th, when we have the Vespers for the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, which take place here. As a matter of fact, this church has been charged for all sorts of ecumenical activities and initiatives. That's the job of this church, really. And so from the Week of Christian Unity, where it's featured very heavily, but perhaps the most beautiful moment of the year is when the Pope comes, usually with a representative of the Eastern Church. They pray together at the tomb of St. Paul.
Next time you're in Rome, make sure that you don't miss this monumental beauty, so rich in significance, history, and art.